your body is telling you, if this state remains as it is, if I have this constant state of inflammation, your lifespan would be shortened. You can't decrease the number of candles on your birthday cake, but you can modify your biological age.
Welcome to the Siim podcast. Our guest today is Raghav Sehgal. Raghav is a PhD candidate at Yale University who uses AI to tackle the question, can we slow, stop, or reverse human aging? He's also the creator of Symphony Age, which is a biological age clock based on 11 organ systems. Raghav, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me here, Siim. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, I found or stumbled upon this paper that you recently published and co-authored, and it was about this epigenetic age interventions, which is a pretty popular topic over the last few years. These different epigenetic age clocks and biological age itself as a concept and how it relates to longevity. So yeah, I'm super excited to have you on the show. So I guess we can maybe start with maybe you can give a short overview of what did you look at in the study? What were the kind of overview of what was our main findings?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll give you some context of how we actually came about to think about this study, because I think the context here matters a lot. So I come from sort of the field of epigenetic biomarkers, and I was trained with Dr. Morgan Levine, who sort of built one of the first mortality predictors in epigenetic clocks. It's called PhenoAge. And under her mentorship, I built this clock called Systems Age, which can measure aging in sort of 11 different organs of your body from a single DNA methylation blood draw, which is very exciting. And when we were doing sort of the validation of our this new biomarker called Systems Age, one of the things that I observed was a lot of the validation of these biomarkers was mostly in context of prognosis, which is how does a biomarker behave in terms of future disease outcomes. So I was really curious about what about responsiveness to interventions? How do these biomarkers respond to interventions? And that was kind of my key question here when I was thinking about this study. So what I did was, the question was, how do these biomarkers respond to interventions? So for that, what we really needed to do was look at clinical trials. So what I did was I went to the literature and started looking at clinical trials. And the sad story about that is that, unfortunately, when we go into literature, there are clinical trials looking at sort of these epigenetic clocks or DNA methylation aging biomarkers, but they're typically sort of looking at maybe a handful of them, one or two of these biomarkers. And that poses a problem, because then you can't do a systematic analysis of saying which of these biomarkers are being responsive or not responsive, so on and so forth. So we were okay, I guess that's where we need to solve a problem. And that problem was, why don't we systematically collect a lot of clinical trial and interventional analysis data for a lot of different types of interventions, whether it's lifestyle, pharmacological, supplements, medical procedures, all related to longevity, and then try to see which DNA or epigenetic biomarkers are responding to these interventions. And that kind of about this study. And as you can see, the results are really astonishing and surprising as we are seeing.
Right. Yeah, we'll go into the results of the top performers shortly, but that's kind of interesting that or I at least maybe we can talk about some of the concept behind this epigenetic age or biological age as well, because many people aren't aware of what it means, and also some people use it differently. So how do you define epigenetic age, and is it different from chronological age as well as your biological age?
For sure. So in some ways, so chronological age, as you know, is, I would say, the number of candles on your last birthday, right? As simple as that, right? And that's how I define it. Biological age is a little more complicated. There is no quantifiable way of saying what biological age is. People use different proxies of saying what biological age could be, right? It could be how much time you have left to dying, for example, right? Which we call time to mortality. It could be how much time you have left to getting your first chronic disease, such as diabetes or cardiovascular disease, right? Which is often described as health span. Uh, uh, and so biological age is a little more complicated in that sense. But for simplicity, it's what how quickly your body is aging, right? And we can measure it by different ways. We can measure it by biomarkers, so on and so forth. Now, when we talk about epigenetic age, what we are really trying to do is trying to quantify this biological age using sort of molecular data. In this case, the molecular data is epigenetics. And again, you could use potentially any other kind of molecular data. You could use proteins, you can use metabolites, you can use sort of transcriptomic data, you can use sort of clinical biomarkers, any of these things. The reason why epigenetics is really interesting is because of the fact that we have seen that has been associated with aging and aging outcomes like cardiovascular disease and diabetes and a bunch of other diseases, as well as mortality and so on and so forth. So we have a very strong indication that it predicts biological age really well, which is why we think that it is somehow able to capture biological age at a molecular level. So epigenetic age is what, so we don't know what biological, we can't quantify biological age. We do, unlike chronological age, we cannot count the number of candles, right, for biological age. So we make proxies for it. And epigenetic age is in a way a proxy for biological age.
Gotcha. Yeah. So the epigenetics is it refers to epigenetics, so above genetics, so it's everything like your environment and lifestyle, everything that's affecting your genes, and it's like changes a lot between people.
That's absolutely correct, Siim. So think about it this way: if our genome or genes define our trajectory of life in some ways, right? Our previous experience are sort of how we're going to live or what our lifespan is going to be in some ways, right? Because our genes do define some of that. There is a certain part of environment and that can define our lifespan further. The fact that you smoke, or the fact that you perform exercise, or the fact that you do not do any of those things, or maybe you're eating healthy or not eating healthy, or taking some interventions, you have stress. All of this can further modify whether you're going to have a long life or a short life, or whether you're going to have diseases quickly or slowly, right? So genes play an effect, but there is something more than genes that can affect your lifespan or your occurrence of diseases. And what does that additional thing that is at the molecular level affecting it? It is potentially epigenetics. Epigenetics is, on a very sort of biological level, if I may explain this. So you have the DNA strand. These epigenetics are essentially sort of these little groups that get added on top of the DNA strand. We call them DNA methylation groups at the very simple level, which we measure in these clocks. And these groups, what they allow to do is essentially allow some genes to be expressed more or some genes to be expressed less. And by controlling the expression of these genes, you can essentially control whether a disease may happen or not happen, right? Or functionality of these genes. So it's a very complex process in some ways. But these little sort of groups can really control a wide amount of expression and effectively control the lifespan of a person.
Right. So the DNA methylation age or DNA methylation clocks, they're They're epigenetic age clocks.
Yes,
Mm.
exactly.
Yeah. So
So
I've seen a lot of different, I guess, companies using the DNA methylation, I guess, term for their clocks.
that's correct. So again, there could be other kind of epigenetics as well. So DNA methylation is just one kind of epigenetic modification, as we call them.
Mm.
Uh, and I'm not going to go into details about that. So DNA methylation is one, DNA ethylation, there could be hydroxylation, there are histone modifications, lots of different things. But the one that we have studied in a lot of detail in context of aging has been DNA methylation, and that has been shown to be associated with changes in with aging.
Mm. Gotcha. And with age, then these processes get like more dysfunctional. So like epigenetic alterations and stuff like that are like hallmarks of aging that are characteristic of the aging process.
So we are still trying to sort of understand exactly how sort of the epigenome is controlling the different hallmarks and the different processes. I think there is a huge field of research that is going on in this. But we do see in general there is a dysregulation, right? That happens. Now, the question is whether this is a programmed dysregulation, that is our body programmatically causing this dysregulation, right? Or is this sort of chaotic, right? Is it out of our control? Is it out of control of our body? Because if it is a program, it's a lot easier for us to change that program. But if it's chaotic, it's a lot more difficult for us to remove the chaos, so to
Mm.
speak. Uh, and that kind of goes back to the idea of interventions, right? That it would be a lot easier for us to build interventions if it's programmed versus if it's chaotic. It's a lot more difficult for us to build interventions.
I want to take a quick break to let you know that you can now get my new book, The Longevity Leap, on Amazon. It contains 24 chapters ranging from the biology of aging to all the major chronic diseases such as heart disease, kidney disease, neurodegeneration, and I also cover over 70 clinically relevant biomarkers for chronic diseases and their optimal ranges. You can get the book from the link in the description. Right. And in the study you published, you use different types of these clocks. So there's, at least a dozen that I've seen that you have Horvath 1, Horvath 2, and different kinds of clocks.
110
What's the
actually,
right?
110 biomarkers.
Okay.
Uh, yeah. So we use actually about 16 really well-known of these clocks, right?
Mm.
But also use sort of these 94 different DNA methylation proxies. So a lot of different, we really wanted to go really deep and say, let's look at everything that's out there, right?
Mm.
Um, and I'll give you a really interesting insight. We actually now have, on the follow-up study, we actually got access to a lot many more clocks. We might actually have 3,600 DNA methylation biomarkers now. So we're going to go even deeper and really do a systematic analysis of like, how are these biomarkers really being affected? But the question is, what we really is, are the prominent biomarkers changing, and are the sort of other biomarkers changing or not?
Mm-hmm. Right. Gotcha. Which one of those clocks tends to be like the go? Is there like one of the issues I've seen is that you have a lot of companies using different tests and they have their different clocks, and you can do the same, not the same test, but you do it at the same time with different tests and you get different results. So is there really like gold standard, or what is the like most accurate test or clock?
So I don't think I'm in the space of commenting upon which is the best test or not, because again, each test has its own part, right?
Mm.
Uh, I think in our study we're commenting upon only one aspect of these tests, which is the responsiveness, right?
Right.
Uh, All of these clocks are powerful in different aspects. Some of them are more prognostic, some of them are more reliable, some of them, and there are different dimensions to be measured. What we're, and a lot of the times it's context dependent, right? So, for example, I'll give you an example that if you were to be, I'll give you a really simple example. That if you were to want to be studying specifically an intervention which is slowing down skin aging, right? And you're looking at skin tissue, right? Uh, a lot of the clocks that are sort of we recommend as being responsive might not be great because the best clock for skin aging is actually a generation one skin and blood clock, right? Which has specifically been built for skin aging, right? So again, some of the information is context dependent here. What we
Right.
did was a very sort of generalized study in the human context, but again, context matters. So I think there are nuances to this whole process. Uh, so for me, I would say though, in general, what I understand is as new generations of clocks evolve, right? They tend to become better and better, right? So I see them as sort of four different generations right now, if I may sort of explain that to you. So we have generation one clocks, right? Which were what we call as chronological age predictors, the number of candles on your last birthday, right? Uh, and so they were simply predicting chronological age, which was great. They were kind of associated with diseases. They were kind of associated with mortality, but not that great, right? We didn't know anything about their reliability. We didn't know anything about their responsiveness. So then came sort of the second generation clock. So the first generation clocks, and the examples of that are the Horvath clock, the first clock that was made, the Horvath clock. That's the perfect example of it. Or maybe if you might have heard about the Hannum clock, that's another very good example. Um, the second generation clock came about, and those include sort of the pheno age and the grim age, right? And I call them the Gen 2 plus because they predict mortality, right? And and also sometimes more complex traits like rate of aging, like Dunedin POM, like the rate of aging metrics, right? Which is really exciting because now they were able to sort of predict diseases a lot better, like disease outcomes, future disease outcomes, and future mortality. We were looking at 7 years, 10 years of follow up, right? And they were able to predict health outcomes and mortality with really good accuracy, right? So that's great. One of the issues still remained was reliability. So what happened was we tested for reliability for these clocks, and we saw that if you were to measure the same sample twice, right, you would get a lot of error. That means that if you were to run the same sample from an individual twice through the analysis pipeline, one time you'll get 5 year, like plus 5 years, like 55 for you, and the next time you'll get 45. That's not good, right? So to fix that, we had a new generation of clocks called Generation Reliable, right? That worked on improving this issue, right? So we had Grimage V2, Dunedin Pace, so on and so forth, right? And these really improved upon this issue, and now we don't have like this really big error ranges, right? So we are really like, if you were to run it twice, you'll probably get like 50.1 and 49.9, or 50.1 and 50, right? So not a lot of error, which is great. But now there's like a fourth generation of clocks, which I call them as generation explainable, which is really exciting in my opinion, or Gen X. And these Gen X clocks are what are really driving insights. So these include sort of what we call as the system scores clock, the ones that I built, or the There are other clocks called causal clocks, and their ability is really strong because what they can do is give insight to people. So, for example, till now, all of these clocks were telling you that, hey, you're 5 years older. Like you go to a clinician and you get this clock measured, or you get this clock measured, right? It'll tell you, hey, Siim, you're 3 years younger than you're supposed to be, or you're 5 years older than you're supposed to be. But what do you do with that information? Not
Mm.
much, right? But now you can get to know, like, oh, the reason you're 5 years older is because your heart is 10 years older than it's supposed to be. Now, that's a little more insightful, right? You can probably act upon it. You can think your clinician can act upon it, right? And that's really useful. And similarly, now you have sort of omic MH, which can go even further down and look at sort of proxies of proteins and metabolites. So it can tell you the reason your heart age is really high is because these proteins and metabolites are really, really changing significantly without actually measuring the proteins and metabolites, just using epigenetic data, right? Which is really amazing, in my opinion, right? So you have really, like, I think the expansiveness of the field is going above and beyond, where you're really able to go down to the nitty gritties of why an individual is aging. And that is the part, in my opinion, of these clocks that, but overall, what the question remains is that whether any of these clocks are responsive. So we have looked at their prognostic nature. They seem to be more and more prognostic now, more and more explainable, right? We have improved upon that reliability. But the question is, are they responsive, right? And that's what the paper really goes into.
Yeah, I guess that's a good segue then to what did you find? So you had 51 interventions and different results with them. So yeah, maybe we can walk or we'll go through what from the top performance, what was like the best effect in terms of reducing epigenetic age?
Yeah. So what's really interesting about the study, in my opinion, is that each of the individual interventional studies are not huge, right? They vary from tens of individuals to hundreds of individuals, right? So they're relatively small trials or relatively small interventional studies. So in some ways, the individual assessment of the trials, right, are not. I cannot certainly say, right, that they're decreasing epigenetic age, right? Like, for example, we saw metformin decreasing epigenetic age quite high, which is great. I'm quite excited by it. But we did not see something like rapamycin decreasing epigenetic age, which I was disappointed by, or semaglutide not decreasing epigenetic age, which I was disappointed by. We saw a lot of diets, right? A lot of diets decreasing epigenetic age across the board, and even diets in combination with exercise decreasing epigenetic age, but one particular exercise intervention not decreasing epigenetic age. So I don't think we can really, like, and the problem is also these trials are very different in different populations. So for example, like the size study was in postmenopausal women, and was a cohort of 20 people for just 12 weeks, right? So it's a very small study run for a very small period of time, right? As opposed to some of the diet interventions were for 2 years, right? So relatively a longer period of time, right? So again, with 60 people and 180 people. So again, different parameters altogether, right? But what's really exciting is that even though individually these studies, right, are not able to tell us much of a story, when you agglomerate their data for a biomarker, they can tell us a story, right? They can tell us a story that whether across all of these studies, across the board, right, across these 51 interventions, is a biomarker being responsive, right? Because what you would expect is like, okay, sure, in some of these things are working, some of them are not, some of these studies are perfect, some of them are bad studies, good apples and bad apples, and there must be an averaging out effect. But overall, you would expect that there should be a net positive effect if the interventions are longevity focused, which we show that about 50% of them seem to be decreasing epigenetic age, even if you take into account the responsive and non-responsive biomarkers. So the first figure that we showed, we haven't done any analysis on which clocks are responsive, which clocks are not responsive. We just do an average out effect, right, of the epigenetic age and say like, hey, we're not thinking about which clocks are responsive, which clocks are not responsive. Let's just look at the average epigenetic age across each of these interventions and just try to see, have we curated a database of interventions that are generally longevity focused, right? And as you see from that sort of that scatter plot, which has gotten really popular on social media, about 50% of them, right, show a decrease in epigenetic age, which is a really good sign for us to say that, hey, yeah, these interventions are decreasing epigenetic age, more or less speaking, which is not to say that any particular intervention is good or bad, right? It is to say that generally the database that has been curated, right, is a longevity interventions database. That's kind of the focus to in that particular figure.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah. And a lot of them I saw that were these kind of anti-TNF therapies or anti-inflammatory therapies.
Yep.
And I guess you would presume that in those trials that the people getting that therapy had like higher baseline inflammation, and you have like a reduction in the inflammation, which then kind of explains this kind of a big effect from the in the epigenetic age.
And you see that trend, right? That a lot of generally, if you have high inflammation, you'll probably have decrease in epigenetic age. We see that even in the most affected intervention as well, which is the art therapy, which is so if you might know this, so the art therapy is in HIV positive. It's given to HIV positive individuals. And it is typically the first line of therapy given once they are tested positive for HIV. And what it does is it really helps them increase their immune cell count and their T cell count in the body and counteract chronic inflammation. And without this therapy, their lifespan would be really short. But with this therapy, their lifespan extends significantly. So the epigenetic clocks are actually capturing what they're supposed to. They are showing that the epigenetic age has gone down and their lifespan is increasing indeed, right? With this art.
Yeah.
And significantly, quite dramatically, right? But the thing is, the way it's happening is through inflammation, right? Like one of the ways it's happening is through sort of decrease in chronic inflammation. And again, there are different dimensions that can be captured in epigenetic clocks. Inflammation is one of them.
Yeah. Yeah. And inflammation is one of the biggest things that affects those clocks. I've seen like, the COVID or just physiological stress or some other like infections tend to increase the, I guess, epigenetic age results if you do like some of these tests.
Yeah. So I think that's a really interesting question to me as well, right? That does epigenetic, and we need to constructively think about biological age as a construct as well, right? That goes back to the question of what is biological age, right? Is biological age something that can fluctuate, right, over a period of time? So, for example, take something like COVID, right? If you have COVID and during the period of time, you have really high inflammation, right? In some ways, your body is telling you that, yes, if this state remains as it is, if I have this constant state of inflammation, right, your lifespan would be shortened.
Yeah.
If this does not get fixed, my lifespan will be shortened. That is what your body is telling you, right? Which is what the epigenetic clock is telling you, right? that, hey, you have inflammation in your body. You have your epigenetic age, your biological age is accelerated. If this is not fixed, you're going to probably have mortality sooner than later, right? And that's what kind of is happening, right? Which is what we see in sort of chronic COVID patients as well, sort of long COVID patients as well, that instead of their biological age going down, it consistently remains high. So what happens is if you recover from COVID and kind of go down, like become healthy, you your co sort of your biological age goes down. But if you have long COVID, it kind of stays stagnant and remains high or
Mm.
relatively high compared to what it was earlier. Um,
Right.
and that to me is an example of the biological age and the epigenetic age measuring something very critical, right? That it is telling you that, hey, your body is telling you that something's wrong, something's off. Your lifespan is going to be shortened if something's not done. And so it's important for us to think about the constructs of what it means to measure biological age.
Mm. Yeah, so it's like a snapshot in time of the current state of the body,
Exactly.
and you can move it, up or down with the age.
Yes. And so unlike chronological age, which is very fixed, right? Biological age can be a little more dynamic, right? Uh, it it changes, right? Which is why if you were if you were unhealthy, right, and you were not sort of exercising, you were not eating healthy, your biological age would be high. But if you start exercising, you start eating healthy, you start doing the right stuff, your biological age would go down, right? So it's a snapshot, right? It modifies, right? Which is what we want biological age to be, right? You can't modify
Mm.
chronological. You can't decrease the number of candles on your birthday cake, right? But you can modify your biological age because that is how you would want it to be, right? Only because that's how you would potentially be able to live a longer, healthier life.
Mm. But the chronological age is a huge, I guess, a factor of the biological age. So that if you're, 80 years old, your biological age will by default be, higher than someone who is 20 years old.
That is absolutely correct. There is no doubt about that. That if you're 80 years old, the chances of your biological age being 20 are much lower,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
Uh, than someone who is 20 years old. But the matter of fact is, right, that hopefully in the future, as we move towards more sort of innovative therapies and we're moving away. So at this point, we're at the real sort of, I would say, at a revolution in some ways, right? So
Mm.
we have known sort of lifestyle interventions work, right? We know sort of interventions like diet and exercise, the kind that you do, the kind of stuff that we sort of prescribe, clinicians prescribe all the time, they work. We also know certain pharmacological interventions are starting to show effects like metformin, semaglutide, so on and so forth, right? We're trying to run trials, all of those things. But the real change would be where all of these are what we call as essentially there are three things that can happen. You can slow down aging. So if you were to think about aging, right, as a rate, you can slow it down, you can stop it, or you could reverse it, right?
Mm.
At this point, all we are doing is slowing it down through these interventions. How much is different, right? So something like lifestyle will slow it down slightly, pharmacological maybe more, right? Um, but what would be interesting is if we are able to stop it or reverse it, right? And interventions like maybe like epigenetic reprogramming, right? That are currently being developed, which I, by the way, did not have in this in this study. I wish I did, but there are no studies right now on epigenetic programming in humans. Uh, but if we had something like those could really reverse epigenetic age.
Mm.
Till now, what we are seeing, as I said, is slowing down of epigenetic age. So in no place do I say that epigenetic age has been reversed or we have
Right.
rejuvenated
Right.
humans. I think we're still a step away from rejuvenating the epigenome, right?
Mm.
When we're able to do that, that's the point where I will say a chronologically 80-year-old man or a chronologically 80-year-old person can actually be of biological 20 years of age.
Mm.
And I don't think that future is far away.
Right. So it's, yeah, like you need some more powerful interventions than just metformin or some of this anti-TNF therapy.
That
Uh,
is correct.
but
I
interesting, like, one of the interventions that resulted in increased epigenetic age was this follistatin gene therapy, which
hmm,
is kind of in that realm of gene therapies, but it resulted in higher age. So
yes.
what do you think about that?
So again, as I said, one-off studies, right? A
Mm.
small study with, I think this was, if I pull up the data here and I'm looking at it,
Yeah, it can't be any more than maybe a few people
um,
because
yeah,
it's
so
such a cringe
follistatin
topic.
gene therapy was about how many people we're looking at? I have all the data. So we have about 25 people in the study,
Mm. Wow,
right?
that's surprisingly
So
much.
yeah, it's still a decent sized study, and let me see how long this was. This was about a year-long study, right? So it's not a small study for sure, right?
Mm.
Uh, as you saw, right, we're looking at the effects across both the reliable and the non-reliable clocks, right? Sorry, the across both the responsive and the non-responsive clocks,
Mm.
right? You actually look at some of the just the responsive clocks. Follistatin gene therapy actually decreases in some
Okay.
of the and so and then again, if you look at specific DNA methylation biomarkers, right, for specific proteins and specific protein proxies and metabolite proxies, right, and specific systems, again, we see follistatin gene therapy decreasing epigenetic age. So I think again, the context matters, right? These are small studies, different contexts, different this thing. I should also point out something really interesting here that the follistatin gene therapy trial was done in a really, really healthy population, right? Um, while a lot of the other trials that we have are in what we call as people who already had diseases, right? And think about it this way. If you already have a disease, right? You already have a lot of ailments, you already have inflammation, you already have metabolic syndrome, you already have a lot of disorders. It's a lot easier to fix you.
Yeah.
That makes it a lot easier to get a response, to decrease your epigenetic age, to improve your biological age,
Mm.
right? But if you're already very healthy, right? It's a
You're at
lot
low
more
inflammation. Yeah.
difficult to improve you. Like, for example, right? For you, Sim, right? If we were to try, you seem like a really healthy person already, right? If we were to try some of these therapies, right? I would say we might not see much of a response, right?
Mm.
Because you're already a very healthy person, right?
Right.
And to then try and decrease your epigenetic age significantly further would actually be really, really challenging, right? Because you might have actually maxed out in some ways by doing everything that you can in by doing lifestyle and maybe some other interventions that you may practice, like supplements and so on and so forth, right?
Right.
But with people who may not be as healthy, who may be suffering through some chronic disease or so on and so forth, the scope for improvement is a lot more, right? So again,
Yeah.
varies a lot on population, and we actually show this in one of the analysis that we do that if you compare between healthy and diseased populations, right? So if a population of the study was healthy a priori, or the population had a disease, uh, the effects are very different on these biomarkers. And you get much stronger effects in these epigenetic biomarkers, which makes sense. We get a much stronger response because there's a lot more scope for improvement.
Mm. Yeah. So like you're closer to the ceiling if you're healthy.
Yeah.
And if you have high inflammation, you take a really hard pharmaceutical that lowers the inflammation, then
Yeah.
your epigenetic age will go down.
Well, not just inflammation, but any other thing, right?
Mm.
Like you have metabolic syndrome, you have any other. So there's so many dimensions to aging, right? You have musculoskeletal aging, metabolic syndrome, cognitive aging. Only any of those could be targeted, and epigenetic age will sort of capture that.
Mm.
Uh, and that's kind of the power here.
Is that the reason why some of the exercise and diet interventions didn't have like a mass or significant effect on the score? That
So
usually there would be like kind of healthier people doing those things.
So with the diet ones, we saw massive changes, I would say, like consistent changes across the board. Uh, and again, the effect sizes themselves were pretty consistent and significant across the board, and they were quite beautiful, I would say. Like and I would say this is one of the biggest studies comparing a lot of diets. We had Mediterranean diet, we had low fat diet, low carb diet, vegan diet, calorie restriction, intermittent fasting, and I think low fat diet with exercise, low carb diet with exercise, low fat diet without exercise, low fat diet without exercise. So just like a huge combination, and omnivore diet. So just like a huge combination of diets and this thing and exercise, of course. Um, and with the diets, we saw a consistent decrease across the board. We also saw a consistent decrease with sort of the systems, right? The system scores that we had. So, for example, consistently we saw metabolic aging going down as measured by sort of the DNA methylation biomarker. We saw musculoskeletal aging going down. We saw chronic inflammation going down. And we also saw stuff like cardiovascular aging going down, which is great. All things that we would expect to go down with diet. Um, the and these were again in predominantly healthy populations. What I will say is it goes back to the kind of studies that are being run, right? So a lot of the good diet clinical trials that we had were run for 2 years, right? Which is a really good clinical trial. But the one exercise trial that I was talking about was in a really small population of postmenopausal women with, I think, like I don't recall, like 15 women, or let me pull that data up here. Um, yeah, that was about uh, that was about yeah 40 women or something, and it was just for 14 weeks. So it's like a very short period of time to actually observe a lot of changes, and in a very specific population again. And they were so again, context matters here. Um, I would say again that when you look at diets plus exercise, you see a lot of change in the epigenetic ages and significant changes. So the point again to go back here is that the studies themselves are very different, right? So sometimes comparing them is challenging themselves, right? And so the easier way that I think about that is 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 that this is not an analysis about saying which intervention is better, right? It's more about analysis of saying which biomarker are responsive,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Rather, I would say that this study will help us identify the biomarkers which will be used in clinical trials that will be for eventual interventions to know which interventions are better,
Gotcha.
right? Because right now, for example, if we were to run a clinical trial for any of these interventions, it will take us years, maybe, to actually really get an answer. So think about running an actual longevity intervention clinical trial, right? Um, the end outcome is mortality, right? Or number of chronic diseases a person or a bunch of people have had in that trial. Now, a trial like that would take essentially 30 years. Say you start prescribing this medication or this intervention at the age of 60, you're essentially running this trial till these people pretty much die, right? Uh, Now, that's a trial being run for 20, 30 years. That's just not feasible, right? So
Right.
what you need are proxy biomarkers that can tell you, right? And those proxy biomarkers, as we call them as surrogate endpoints, right, need to be prognostic, reliable, and responsive, right?
Mm.
We have
Gotcha.
shown DNA methylation biomarkers or epigenetic clocks are prognostic and reliable. We just need to check for their responsiveness, right? And that's kind of what this study is really trying to figure out, right? That are they responsive? Um, and now we are seeing some early indications that they are responsive. And once we are able to do that, then we can actually run a clinical trial to say that which interventions are really slowing down epigenetic age. Because right now, these trials are very different. They're very small, have very different populations. So doing a head-to-head comparison is slightly challenging.
Right. So it looks like, yeah, it kind of draws back to the biomarkers of that
Exactly.
matter with these clocks. So what were the kind of main biomarkers that you saw affected the epigenetic age?
Yeah, so it goes back to sort of the conversation you and I were having about sort of these different generations of biomarkers, right? So we had the Gen 1, which were the chronological age predictors like Horvath and Hannum, Gen 2, which were the mortality predictors and sort of rate of aging predictors, like the first version of Grim age, the first version of PhenoAge, the first version of Dunedin pace of aging. Uh, and then we had Generation Reliable, right? So the next version of Dunedin Pace, it's the newest version of Grimage, PC PhenoAge, PC Grimage, and then we have the Generation Explainable or Gen X clocks, right? And what we have seen is there are two sets of clocks that are sort of or two sets of biomarkers that are responsive. It is sort of the generation reliable and the Gen X clock. So not the Gen 1, not the Gen 2, the Gen R and the Gen X, right? Which are responsive to interventions. And the reason for that is pretty simple, that if a biomarker is reliable, right, it will have a lot less noise, right? And if it has a lot less noise, then the errors on it would be a lot smaller. And if the errors are a lot less smaller, right, that means that mathematically you can get a significant uh, uh, difference quite easily, right? Um, and that's why you have kind of, as soon as you started developing sort of these reliable biomarkers, you have them um, as more being responsive. So in general, sort of Grimage V2, PC Grimage, Dunedin Pace, Systems Age, all these, the system scores, the omic image components, all of these seem to be sort of the biomarkers that are most responsive to different interventions. Amidst these, what we are seeing is sort of PC Grimage and Dunedin Pace were really, really responsive.
Mm-hmm. Right. So inflammation is, I guess, one of the primary ones that affects a lot of these results. With metformin, you would also predict like the blood sugar can have an effect.
Um, well, inflammation is just one dimension of aging, I would say. And we see that a lot of different dimensions are changing. So, for example, when we did the analysis with different diets, we saw sort of like musculoskeletal aging and sort of cardiovascular aging and other sort of aging dimensions all significantly changing, which was amazing in my opinion. And so I think chronic inflammation is definitely a really critical angle of aging, right? Which is being captured by these clocks. But I've been a proponent of the idea that aging is very multidimensional, right? And we need to capture all of these different dimensions to really understand um, aging. And that goes when we're studying sort of the responsiveness of these biomarkers as well, right? That we need to understand the responsiveness from different angles.
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned also earlier that you had developed this like organ system age, systems age. So maybe we can talk about that as well. Like, how does it differ from some of these other epigenetic age clocks? And yeah, what use can it have?
For sure. It's a really interesting biomarker because so I'll tell you the exciting part about it. The reason we ended up developing this was the simple question that plagues all of epigenetic clocks, which is a big criticism of epigenetic clocks is that they're not explainable. A lot of people come to us and say like, "Hey, you tell us that you're 5 years older, right? But what do we do about it, right? You tell us we are 3 years younger. How do we make ourselves more younger? Uh, what do we do about this information,
Mm.
right? Great. It's great. You did an amazing job telling us we are 3 years younger than we are supposed to be, right? Our chronological age is 50. We're 47. That's great. But how do I make it 45? Right? I don't know. They didn't know, right? And that kind of drove us to the question that how do we give them more insight into this, right? Oh, well, one way to do it is, of course, you can go and do a bunch of different sort of clinical biomarker tests, get 20 different blood draws done, and figure out, oh, my metabolic biomarkers are high, my cardiac biomarkers are high, all of those things, yada yada yada. But can we simplify it further? Can we just link it back to epigenetic age? And that's kind of what drove this whole analysis, right? And so what we did was very simple. We took all of these biomarkers that were associated with different organs, and we had about 130 different biomarkers, from functional biomarkers like how much you can walk, how quickly you can walk, can you pick up a piece of dime from the floor, to cognitive biomarkers like how quickly you remember things, stuff like that, to more clinical chemistry biomarkers and stuff. And then we just predicted it using epigenetic data for all the different organs. We grouped them into different organs, right? So brain biomarkers, heart biomarkers, lung biomarkers, kidney biomarkers, musculoskeletal biomarkers, inflammation biomarkers, so on and so forth. And then we predicted it using epigenetic data. Once we did that, it was perfect. We could just essentially predict aging in each of these different organs. And we were able to then validate it in about 25 different diseases. So what we showed was that, for example, the heart score that we had was most predictive of cardiovascular disease, better than the other epigenetic clocks that are out there. Or the brain score we had was really predictive of cognitive decline. Or the physical function score, the musculoskeletal score we had was really predictive of arthritis and physical function decline, right? Or so on and so forth, right? And we did this for 25 different aging phenotypes in about sort of 10,000, I don't know, even remember how many different samples that this individuals this time. And then what we did was went even further. We went and said, okay, well, we have these different individuals, right? Why don't we see, based on these systems, can we group them into different categories almost of aging, right? So we did like what we call a very simple cluster analysis. And based on aging, that aging in different organs, we grouped them into different clusters. And we saw there were 9 different aging patterns, right? Or we can call them aging subtypes. So people were aging in 9 different ways based on their organ systems. And that leads to 9 all different kinds of diseases. So for example, a very interesting example that came out of it was there were people who a lot of them were smokers, and they fell in 3 different categories, right? Not all of them actually developed lung cancer, or cardiovascular disease. Only two of those categories developed cardiovascular disease, right? And they had high heart and high lung aging. And that was really interesting to us. But there was one separate category, separate from the smokers, that developed heart and lung, developed cardiovascular disease, right? And that group had really high metabolic aging. So now think about it, Sim. Both of these groups have cardiovascular disease events. They both get heart attacks and they go to the doctor. Both of them will be treated similarly, right? But their underlying aging biology is very different. One of them is a smoker, they have high lung aging. The other one is probably obese and has high metabolic aging. They
Right.
should probably not be treated similarly, right?
Yeah.
And
Makes
that's a insight. They should probably be personalized in their treatments,
sense.
right? And and that's kind of the really next generation of thinking about how we should be thinking about aging and aging phenotypes and aging in general when we are thinking about clinics and in clinical practice.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, that different parts of the body age in different ways depending on the lifestyle and genetics,
Yes, exactly.
and even like randomness in some sense.
That's, yep.
Um, is it the same as the symphony age?
That's
The
correct. So we patented this, and then True Diagnostics was really interested in licensing this out, and now they have licensed it out, and they're using it. They've actually now about 10,000 different patients have used it, and it's been used in about 20 different clinical interventional studies and trials. So it's really catching pace and really garnering a lot of attention. I'm really excited about it. That I was able to make such a contribution, and all of this was in collaboration with Dr. Morgan Levine. So I'm really sort of excited that this work is able to reach the masses, honestly. Uh,
Mm,
it's rare, honestly, for someone like me, like a PhD student during his PhD career, to get to translate something so quickly. So it's a lot thanks to Morgan and True Diagnostics that this happened.
mm. Yeah, I've done the symphony age test, and like
Did you
like
find
my
anything interesting?
what?
Did you find anything interesting?
Yeah, well, like my liver is like 9 years old in that test.
Okay. Okay. Have you been drinking a lot, Sim?
Yeah. Well, I've been not drinking for like 10 years,
Okay.
so maybe that's kind of affecting that. Uh, but yeah, I mean, every other age is also like lower than my chronological age. So the average was like 17, I think. I remember it was 17.
Amazing. Well, we should discuss about why your liver age is high at some point. I'd love to give my insights on it.
Yeah. Um, is there anything else like worth mentioning about, I guess, these clocks or some of these epigenetic age as a whole?
No, I'm just generally very excited about the field. I would say it's really at a turning point in some ways. I think as a field, epigenetics is sort of changing so quickly, and there's so much evolution happening in the field. We're really at the point where there is going to be a revolution in terms of the fact that these biomarkers will be accessible to patients in clinics and in clinical trials.
Mm,
And as soon as that happens, right, uh, we will really be able to transform healthcare from being from having medicine as being reactive, from having medicine being as, oh, you wait till you have a disease and then we will treat you, to having medicine being proactive. We will tell you before you have a disease. We will treat you before you have a disease. Now, that is a paradigm shift in medicine, and that will be driven by biomarkers like the epigenetic clocks. And I am really excited about that. I'm just so
mm,
excited that epigenetic clocks are sort of the heralding force of this change.
mm. Yeah, I guess the challenge is making them more or cheaper. Right now, I guess
Yes.
they're a bit more expensive than regular blood markers and stuff.
That's kind of the exciting part, in my opinion. I think there is a lot of exciting stuff coming out in that sense, because there are new analysis that are where we can do some of these analysis for as cheap as like $50 to $20, and
Wow.
probably some of these will be available to the public in the next, say, few years. So it's just a matter of time, as you know. Um, uh, Sort of sequencing follows this very interesting Moore's law in science. It decreases sort of exponentially in cost. And we're going to see this exponential decrease in cost here as well. Uh, just a couple of years ago, doing a DNA methylation analysis used to cost like tens of thousands of dollars.
Wow.
And now it's what, a couple of $100s, right? I expect it to be a couple of dollars in the next 2 to 5 years.
Mm.
Uh,
Wow.
so, and that's kind of where the future is, in my opinion. Imagine in a couple of dollars, you can get thousands of biomarkers, not hundreds, thousands,
Mm.
thousands of biomarkers in hundreds, in a few dollars.
Yeah. Well,
Isn't
yeah,
that
that's the kind of the ideal scenario for
exactly?
that. But yeah, I mean, I agree that it's gonna be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that the field is, yeah, like exciting, and it's gonna keep advancing. Like we're nowhere near any, like, yeah, like a gold standard at the moment, or need some more advancements.
Exactly. And I think that's kind of the exciting part, right? Like we're also at the point where we're defining the field, right? And I'm so excited, like people like you are really sort of participating in this conversation, right? Because it requires attention, right? It requires people like you to spread the message that there is advancements going on in this field. And I'm just honestly thankful
Mm.
uh have these conversations with with a lot of different people so that we can spread the message.
Yeah, I'm thankful for as well for your work, and looking forward to more of the studies in the future.
Yeah, no,
Uh,
for sure.
yeah, I was gonna ask, like, before I ask my last question, what's where can people learn more about you and your work?
Well, where they can learn about on my website, that is raghav-sagal.com, and also my LinkedIn and my Twitter. I guess I'll send you that link. You can post it on your YouTube and other places. But generally speaking, I do a few things other than being a PhD. I am also sort of director of bioinformatics at Healthy Longevity Clinic, which is a clinic helping people live healthier lives. And I also work as a scientific principal at Longevity Tech Fund, which essentially works on investing in some really next generation longevity companies. I work advice through diagnostics. I help with some other companies as well, do some of my own personal investments in the longevity space. So I'm really sort of ingrained in this space and really excited about the space in general. I'm
Mm.
really passionate about it.
Yeah, that's great. I'll put the links in the show notes. And my last question is, what's this one piece of advice or habit that you wish you adopted sooner?
Um, that I had learned sooner? Is that the question?
Yeah, like, is it some sort of, you wish you started exercising sooner or whatever? Like, some people may have these kind of ideas.
I think sleeping healthier.
Mm.
I used to be a really bad sleeper. Like I used to sleep like as you can understand with all the things that I do, I used to be like working at all hours of the day and then sleeping at 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. And that kind of started giving me really bad sort of headaches and stuff like that. And so I've realized that I think sleeping and sleep quality is such a critical aspect of maintaining good health.
Right.
Sure, eating healthy, exercise, all of those things are critical, and I practice all of that. But sleeping, my God, the day I started sleeping better, started sleeping at 10 p.m. and waking up at like 7 a.m., my life has changed. It's transformative.
Mm. Yeah, that's a very important tip for sure. Many people tend to undersleep.
Yes, sleeping is critical, and maintaining a good sleep cycle can be really important. Something that when I was in my early 20s, I think in your early 20s, you can really stretch yourself and be like,
Mm.
doesn't matter. Now that I'm starting to hit my 30s, I'm like, no, I think old age is hitting me. I'm
Nice.
joking. 30
Yeah,
is not old age.
for sure. Better late than never.
Yeah, better late than never, though. Yes.
Well, yeah, thanks for coming to the show, and yeah, looking forward to the future studies.
For sure. Thanks for having me, Sim. This was a great conversation.
Yeah, likewise. All right, that's it for this episode. Make sure you check out my new book, The Longevity Leap, on Amazon. I'd also appreciate if you share this episode with a friend or family member. Other than that, my name is Siim. Stay tuned for the next episode. Stay empowered.